The courtroom was packed to capacity, a low buzz of murmurs filling the air as everyone waited for the hearing to begin. It wasn't every day that a case like this drew so much attention, partly because of the high-profile defendant and partly because of the unique judge presiding over the matter. At the center of it all was Alexander Grayson, a man who seemed born to wear arrogance like a tailored suit. A tech billionaire with more money than morals, Alexander had spent years dodging consequences for his actions. His latest transgression, though, had landed him in court in front of someone who wouldn't be so easily swayed. Judge Camille Hayes was as unyielding as they came. Her reputation was one of fairness and integrity, a woman who believed that justice wasn't about status or wealth, but the truth. The fact that she was the first black woman to hold this position in her district only added to the weight of her presence in the room. To many, she was a symbol of progress, but to Alexander, she was nothing more than an obstacle he intended to bulldoze. The proceedings began, and as everyone rose for the entrance of Judge Hayes, Alexander remained seated, his arms crossed, and an icy smirk on his face. Gasps rippled through the room as the blatant disrespect settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. Judge Hayes paused mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Without saying a word, she walked to her bench, her expression composed, but her eyes burning with quiet resolve. "Mr. Grayson," she said after a moment, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I see you've chosen to remain seated. Care to explain why?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with disdain. "Respect is earned, not given. And quite frankly, Your Honor, I don't see anything here worth standing for." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the bailiff, a seasoned professional, glanced nervously at the judge, unsure of what might come next. Judge Hayes didn't react immediately, allowing the silence to stretch until it was almost unbearable. "Noted," she finally said, her voice steady. "Proceed." As the case unfolded, Alexander's arrogance was on full display. He interrupted witnesses, scoffed at evidence, and even sneered at the prosecutor's arguments. To him, this entire process was a game, one he was confident he would win because he always had. He was certain his money and influence would shield him, just as they had so many times before. But what Alexander didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that Judge Hayes had been carefully observing every move he made. Beneath her calm demeanor, a plan was forming, one that would not only deliver justice, but leave the entire courtroom stunned. The day's session ended with Alexander still smirking, convinced that he had the upper hand. But as he exited the courtroom, Judge Hayes' parting words echoed in his mind. "Mr. Grayson, tomorrow will be enlightening." The anticipation for the next day was electric. People speculated wildly about what the judge might do. Alexander, however, remained unfazed, even as whispers circulated about how Judge Hayes had never been one to back down from a challenge. What happened next would become the talk of the nation, a defining moment in legal history that no one saw coming, and one Alexander Grayson would never forget. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, its golden rays doing little to warm the chilly air of anticipation that filled the hallways. Word had spread like wildfire about the events of the previous day, and by the time Alexander Grayson strode into the courtroom, the room was packed with spectators eager to witness what would happen next. Reporters sat in the back, their pens poised and cameras discreetly tucked away, while murmurs rippled through the crowd like a restless tide. Alexander, ever the picture of self-assurance, walked with an air of detachment, his tailored suit pristine, and his chin held high. To him, this was just another performance, a chance to remind everyone of his untouchable status. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a reputation for getting wealthy clients out of tight spots, whispered something to him as they approached the defense table. Alexander smirked, but didn't respond. He didn't need advice. He already knew how this would play out. Judge Hayes entered the courtroom, and once again the audience rose to their feet. Once again, Alexander remained seated. This time, however, the room fell into a heavy silence as all eyes turned to the judge. Her expression was unreadable, her movements precise as she took her seat behind the bench. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, commanding respect without needing to demand it. "Before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a court of law. Decorum is expected at all times." Her gaze flicked to Alexander, who met her eyes with a defiant smirk. If the message was meant for him, he certainly didn't show it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table as if bored. The judge's expression didn't falter. The first witness was called to the stand, and as the testimony began, the courtroom settled into an uneasy rhythm. The case revolved around a series of fraudulent business practices, schemes that had left thousands of employees and investors destitute, while Alexander's company raked in billions. The evidence was damning: falsified records, hidden accounts, and a trail of transactions that painted a clear picture of greed and deceit. Yet Alexander sat there, unbothered, as if the facts didn't apply to him. Occasionally, he would lean over to whisper to his lawyer, his tone too low to hear, but his smirk giving away his dismissive attitude. It was as if he believed himself to be invincible, immune to the rules that governed everyone else. The audience watched in a mix of disbelief and indignation. How could someone be so openly disrespectful, so unapologetic, in the face of overwhelming evidence? But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Judge Hayes listened intently, her sharp eyes missing nothing. While she maintained her impartial demeanor, there were moments, a slight tilt of her head, a flicker of thought crossing her face, that suggested she was taking mental notes. She let the proceedings unfold naturally, her silence a deliberate choice, giving Alexander all the rope he needed to tie himself in knots. As the day wore on, the tension in the room grew. Witness after witness testified, each account painting a clearer picture of the damage Alexander had caused. One former employee, an older man with tired eyes and a voice that trembled with emotion, described how he'd lost everything after the company's collapse. His retirement savings, his home, gone in an instant, while Alexander had continued to live in luxury. "I trusted him," the man said, his voice breaking. "We all did. He told us we were part of the family, that he'd take care of us. But in the end, we were just numbers to him. Expendable." Alexander didn't even blink. He sat there, unflinching, as if the man's words were no more than background noise. To him, this was all theater, and he was the star. He knew his lawyer would spin it, turn the focus away from the emotional testimonies and onto technicalities that would cast doubt on the evidence. He'd seen it happen before. Why would this time be any different? But Alexander underestimated the power of perception. The courtroom wasn't just filled with facts and arguments, it was filled with people, human beings who could see through the facade. The spectators, the jury, even the court staff, all of them felt the weight of the stories being shared. And while Alexander may not have cared, Judge Hayes was paying close attention. By mid-afternoon, the air in the courtroom was heavy with a sense of anticipation. The defense had done their best to poke holes in the prosecution's case, but the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss entirely. Still, Alexander's confidence hadn't wavered. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Then came a moment that no one expected. Judge Hayes, who had remained composed and measured throughout the day, suddenly leaned forward, her hands clasped on the bench. Her gaze locked onto Alexander, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in her expression, something resolute, almost unyielding. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone calm, but laced with steel. "Do you believe yourself above the law?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Alexander's smirk faltered, just slightly, before he regained his composure. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I don't think that's relevant to the case at hand." Judge Hayes didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, her gaze never wavering. When she finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate. "It's relevant, Mr. Grayson, because your actions, both in this courtroom and beyond, suggest otherwise. And I believe the court deserves to understand your perspective fully." The tension was unbearable, the weight of her words sinking in like stones dropped into still water. Alexander shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken for the first time. The audience watched, riveted, as the dynamic in the room shifted. For all his bravado, Alexander was beginning to realize that he was no longer in control. The rest of the day's proceedings passed in a blur, but the energy in the room had changed. Alexander's smirk was gone, replaced by a thin-lipped expression that betrayed his discomfort. Judge Hayes remained composed, her focus unwavering as she guided the courtroom through the remaining testimonies. As the session ended and the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Judge Hayes looked directly at Alexander. Her parting words were simple, but carried an undeniable weight. "Tomorrow, Mr. Grayson, the court will hear your perspective in full. I trust you'll be prepared." The courtroom emptied slowly, the spectators buzzing with speculation about what the next day might hold. Alexander left without a word, his usual confidence replaced by a tension he couldn't quite hide. For the first time, the weight of the situation seemed to be settling on his shoulders. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, shouting questions and flashing cameras, but Alexander ignored them, his mind racing. Judge Hayes' words echoed in his ears, their meaning gnawing at him. For a man used to controlling every outcome, the uncertainty was unbearable. As the sun set and the city lights flickered to life, the stage was set for what promised to be a courtroom showdown unlike any other. But no one, not Alexander, not the audience, not even the reporters waiting breathlessly for the next headline, could predict just how stunning the judge's next move would be. The following morning, the courthouse buzzed with an electric energy. The crowd outside had doubled in size, with news vans parked haphazardly along the curb and reporters jockeying for position. The story of Alexander Grayson and his courtroom defiance had spread like wildfire, and now everyone wanted to witness the drama firsthand. Inside, the tension was palpable. The gallery filled quickly, with people whispering speculation about what would unfold. Alexander arrived with the same air of confidence, but his steps seemed heavier, his usual cocky smirk forced and strained. His lawyer walked briskly beside him, flipping through notes and muttering strategy, but Alexander barely acknowledged him. His focus was on the day ahead, and the unpredictable judge who seemed determined to challenge him. As the courtroom settled and Judge Hayes took her seat, the atmosphere shifted again. Her presence, calm and steady, commanded respect. She wasted no time, diving directly into the proceedings. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, "the court has heard extensive testimony regarding the impact of your actions. Today, we'll hear your side. This is your opportunity to clarify, to provide context. Please step forward." The room went silent as Alexander rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his expression carefully composed, but his shoulders carried a subtle tension. He walked to the stand, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Seated and sworn in, Alexander leaned back slightly, trying to project an air of ease, but the judge's unwavering gaze seemed to pin him in place. "Let's start with a simple question," Judge Hayes said, her tone neutral but firm. "In your view, what responsibility, if any, do you bear for the losses incurred by your employees and investors?" Alexander paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He glanced briefly at his lawyer, who gave him a subtle nod, then turned back to the judge. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he began, his tone measured, "business is inherently risky. My company made decisions based on the information available at the time. Not every outcome can be predicted, and while I deeply regret the hardships faced by some, I don't believe I'm solely to blame." The words were polished, rehearsed. He spoke with the precision of someone used to manipulating narratives, but his answer lacked sincerity. The judge tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Not solely to blame," she repeated, as if weighing the phrase. "Yet the evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate deception, falsified records, hidden accounts. Are you suggesting these were merely errors in judgment?" Alexander shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. "I'm saying, Your Honor, that business is complex. Decisions are made at every level, and I wasn't personally involved in every detail. A murmur rippled through the gallery. People leaned forward, whispering to one another, their skepticism evident. Alexander's attempt to deflect responsibility only deepened the audience's disdain. But Judge Hayes remained composed, her sharp eyes never leaving him. As the questioning continued, the courtroom was drawn deeper into the tangled web of Alexander's defenses. He painted himself as a misunderstood innovator, a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But each time he tried to shift the blame, Judge Hayes countered with pointed questions, her calm persistence slowly unraveling his narrative. Meanwhile, the spectators in the gallery were increasingly engaged. Among them sat Maria Alvarez, a single mother who had lost her life savings in Alexander's schemes. Her quiet presence was a stark contrast to the media frenzy outside, but her resolve was just as strong. She had come to witness justice, to see the man who had upended her life held accountable. Her eyes never left him, her expression a mixture of anger and determination. At the back of the room, a young journalist named Ethan Carter furiously jotted notes. This trial was more than just a story to him. It was a chance to expose the rot in a system that allowed men like Alexander to thrive. Ethan's instincts told him there was more to uncover, and he vowed to dig deeper. The day wore on, and Alexander's composure began to crack. The judge's relentless questioning, combined with the weight of the evidence and the eyes of the courtroom bearing down on him, took its toll. He grew defensive, his answers less polished, his tone betraying his frustration. At one point, Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Grayson, you've spoken extensively about the risks of business and the actions of others. But I'm curious, do you feel any personal responsibility for the suffering caused by your company's collapse?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Alexander hesitated, his confident facade faltering. He glanced at his lawyer, then at the judge, then at the expectant faces in the gallery. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the enormity of the moment. "I regret that people were hurt," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "But I did what I thought was best for the company. Sometimes tough decisions have to be made." The gallery erupted in whispers, a mix of disbelief and outrage. To the people who had suffered under Alexander's greed, his words felt hollow, a weak attempt to feign remorse. Maria Alvarez shook her head, her fists clenched tightly in her lap. Ethan Carter scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for his article. Judge Hayes let the murmurs die down before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. You may step down for now." Alexander returned to his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation for what was to come. But as the session drew to a close, it became clear that the most critical moments of the trial were still ahead. Judge Hayes' demeanor remained calm, but her measured words carried a subtle warning. The truth would come out, and justice would not be swayed by arrogance or wealth. Outside, the media swarmed once again, their questions echoing across the courthouse steps. Alexander pushed through the crowd, his jaw clenched, his lawyer at his side. But even as he retreated to the safety of his car, the weight of the day lingered. For the first time, he wasn't sure how this would end, and that uncertainty was a feeling he didn't know how to handle. As the trial entered its final days, the energy in the courtroom became almost unbearable. The gallery was packed tighter than ever, with reporters, victims, and curious onlookers jostling for space. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the air each morning before the session began. And people speculated endlessly about how Judge Hayes would handle the towering case against Alexander Grayson. The tension seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Alexander walked into court that morning, looking as polished as ever, his designer suit tailored perfectly, his posture still upright. But those who had been following the trial closely noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. The man who once strode into the courtroom with arrogant confidence now carried himself with something closer to guarded determination. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed his nerves. Maria Alvarez was in her usual seat, watching him carefully. She had become a quiet but powerful symbol of the victims in this case. She wasn't the loudest or the most outspoken, but her presence carried weight. Ethan Carter, always seated a few rows behind her, noticed the quiet fire in her eyes. He decided that no matter what happened, her voice would feature prominently in his piece. That day, the prosecution brought forward their final witness, a forensic accountant who had spent months combing through Alexander's financial records. The witness was calm, methodical, and devastatingly precise as he laid out a timeline of fraudulent activities. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow. There were the hidden offshore accounts, the falsified earnings reports, the shell companies created to divert funds. The gallery was riveted, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Alexander's lawyer tried to poke holes in the testimony, but it was like trying to stop a dam from breaking with a single piece of tape. Every attempt at deflection or dismissal was met with another clear, irrefutable piece of evidence. The air seemed to leave the room when the accountant pulled up a flowchart on the projector, showing exactly how millions of dollars had been siphoned away, while employees lost their jobs and investors saw their savings vanish. When the prosecution rested, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Maria closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, while Ethan scribbled furiously, trying to capture the mood of the room. Alexander, for his part, sat rigid in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He knew the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore, but he also knew that this was far from over. He glanced at his lawyer, who leaned in to whisper something. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to ease Alexander's tension. Then it was the defense's turn. Alexander's lawyer rose, straightening his tie, and addressed the court with a calm, measured tone. His strategy was clear: portray Alexander as a visionary leader who had been unfairly vilified for his ambition. He argued that the financial discrepancies were the result of mismanagement by lower-level employees, not intentional fraud by his client. It was an uphill battle, and everyone in the room could feel it. The defense called a series of character witnesses, business associates and friends who spoke about Alexander's generosity, his intelligence, and his determination. But their words felt hollow against the mountain of evidence that had already been presented. The jury's faces were impassive, but their body language betrayed their skepticism. Even the gallery seemed less engaged during the defense's case, their energy drained by the relentless revelations of the prosecution. Still, Alexander maintained his composure. He had one final card to play: his own testimony. His lawyer had advised against it, but Alexander was convinced that he could sway the jury. He believed that if he could speak directly to them, he could regain control of the narrative. When Alexander took the stand, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. He began with a carefully rehearsed statement, speaking about his upbringing, his passion for innovation, and his belief in taking risks. He painted himself as a misunderstood genius, someone who had always pushed boundaries for the greater good. At first, his words seemed to land. His charisma was undeniable, and he spoke with a conviction that made people want to believe him. But as the cross-examination began, the cracks in his story began to show. The prosecution asked pointed questions, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his testimony. They brought up specific transactions, showing documents that bore his signature. Each time he tried to deflect, they countered with another piece of evidence. The gallery watched in stunned silence as Alexander's confidence began to unravel. He grew defensive, his answers becoming increasingly erratic. At one point, the prosecutor asked him directly, "Mr. Grayson, can you honestly say that you never once prioritized your own wealth over the well-being of your employees and investors?" Alexander hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The pause hum in the air like a thunderclap. When he finally answered, his voice lacked the conviction it had carried just moments before. "I made decisions that I believed were best at the time," he said, his tone faltering. The prosecutor's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the room. The gallery leaned forward, sensing that the tide had turned. Maria's eyes narrowed, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. Ethan, scribbling furiously, felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment Alexander's facade began to crumble. By the time the day ended, the tension in the courtroom was at its peak. Alexander left the stand looking visibly shaken, his polished exterior fraying at the edges. The gallery buzzed with speculation as people filed out, their whispers filling the halls of the courthouse. Outside, the crowd of reporters was larger than ever, their questions shouted over one another as Alexander and his lawyer pushed through. But Alexander didn't answer a single one. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the narrative was no longer his to control. Inside the courthouse, Judge Hayes remained seated, watching the empty courtroom as the day's events played out in her mind. She knew the weight of the decision she would soon have to make, and the responsibility of ensuring that justice was served. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable, and yet everyone knew that the true climax was still to come. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if everyone knew that something big was about to happen. The defense team appeared unusually tense, huddled together in whispered conversations, while the prosecution seemed more composed, but the sharp glint in their eyes betrayed their focus. Even Judge Hayes, normally a pillar of calm, seemed a little more rigid as she took her seat at the bench. Ethan Carter arrived early as usual, hoping to capture the unfolding drama. He had sensed that the case was approaching its boiling point. The way the crowd buzzed with speculation made him wonder if something bigger was brewing. He couldn't help but notice the nervous glances exchanged by the defense lawyers and their growing unease. When Alexander Grayson entered the courtroom, his once immaculate appearance was now slightly disheveled. He seemed visibly more shaken than the day before, his usually confident stride replaced with a more hesitant gait. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding the gazes of the reporters and spectators, as though he could sense a change in the air. His lawyer, a man usually calm and collected, had the slightest furrow on his brow, clearly troubled by something. Judge Hayes called the court to order, but just before the proceedings could continue, a startling interruption occurred. The doors to the courtroom swung open with an unexpected force, and in walked someone who none of them had expected to see. It was a figure from the past, someone long thought to be irrelevant to the case, yet now somehow central to its shocking twist. A man wearing a worn-out suit and carrying an air of authority stepped into the courtroom, drawing attention instantly. He wasn't on the witness list, nor was he part of the defense or prosecution teams. He was, however, a former business partner of Alexander's. His name was Simon Delacroix, and his reputation was murky at best. Delacroix had been involved in a series of failed business ventures with Alexander Grayson years ago, but he had faded into obscurity after their fallout. Most people assumed he was no longer connected to Grayson in any way. As Simon took the stand, there was a ripple of confusion and tension that swept through the room. His presence was unexpected, and everyone was caught off guard. Alexander looked like he had seen a ghost. His face paled at the sight of Simon, and for a brief moment it seemed like the very ground had shifted beneath him. His lawyer tried to intervene, but Judge Hayes was already allowing Simon to speak. Simon began with a calm yet unsettling tone, recounting the history of his business dealings with Alexander. He spoke of shared investments, joint ventures, and the cutthroat ways in which Alexander had manipulated their partnership for his own gain. However, Simon's testimony didn't just focus on business practices. It took a darker turn. He accused Alexander of using his influence to cover up illegal activities, money laundering, and other unsavory dealings that had never come to light. This revelation stunned the courtroom. The air grew thick with disbelief. Alexander, who had managed to control the narrative until now, was suddenly on the defensive again. Simon's words were damning. It wasn't just the accusations that rattled everyone. It was the mention of a crucial piece of evidence that had never been revealed. Simon claimed to have possession of a secret file, one that had been hidden away for years, detailing Alexander's most incriminating actions. A file so damning that it would destroy Alexander's defense once and for all. The prosecutor's eyes widened as Simon continued to speak. It was clear that this was the bombshell they'd been waiting for, though they hadn't expected it to come from this direction. The defense team, now visibly sweating, exchanged frantic looks. The thought that someone like Simon Delacroix could bring such a critical piece of evidence to the table caught them completely off guard. And then, in a twist that no one saw coming, Simon dropped the bombshell. He pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the witness stand. "I've kept this for years, knowing that one day it would come to this. I never wanted to bring it into the open, but I couldn't watch him escape justice any longer," Simon said, his voice unwavering as he addressed the court. The tension in the room was palpable, every single person now leaning forward, unsure of what would come next. Judge Hayes, her expression unreadable, gave a slight nod, signaling for Simon to hand over the envelope. With an almost ceremonial gesture, she opened it, revealing a series of documents. The gallery gasped as she began reading the first few lines aloud. They were financial documents, transactions, contracts, hidden transfers, all linking Alexander Grayson to a web of corruption far larger than anyone had imagined. The documents detailed under-the-table deals with criminals, evidence of payoffs, and even hints of a conspiracy to manipulate stock prices on a massive scale. Alexander's face twisted in horror, realizing that his worst fears were about to come true. But the shock didn't end there. As Judge Hayes read further, she came upon a part of the document that made the courtroom go silent. There was a list of names, investors, politicians, and businessmen who had been tied to Alexander's schemes. But one name stood out above the rest. It was someone no one expected, someone from the highest echelons of power. A name that, if tied to Alexander's illegal activities, would have ramifications far beyond this trial. The audience exchanged nervous glances. The walls of this case were starting to cave in, and everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And just when it seemed like Alexander's fate was sealed, something even more unsettling happened. The documents that Simon had revealed were not only damning, but they also pointed to an even greater mystery. A secret organization that had been controlling much of the illegal activity that Alexander had been part of. This group, whose influence stretched into the highest offices and the darkest corners of the business world, was now suddenly front and center. Alexander's composure shattered entirely. His hands clenched into fists, his face turning a shade of red that made it clear he had never expected this bombshell. The sudden revelation that there was a larger, more dangerous web surrounding his crimes had completely rattled him. He had thought that he was the one pulling the strings all along, but now he realized that he was merely a pawn in a much bigger game. In the midst of the growing chaos, the prosecutor took a moment to process the new information. This was the opening they had been waiting for. The defense, on the other hand, scrambled to salvage what was left of their case. Their lead attorney, once so confident, now looked visibly shaken. Judge Hayes sat still, her eyes moving between the stunned faces of the courtroom, her mind racing with the implications of what had just unfolded. She knew that the case had taken a turn that no one had expected, and the stakes had never been higher. The question now was, who was really behind all of this? And what would it mean for the future of Alexander Grayson? The room was thick with the smell of uncertainty, and no one, least of all Alexander, knew how things would unfold next.